Excuse me for these big earphones. I use that so I can get the clearest audio possible, because this is important. This is my thesis defense. So hello History Department, and hello professors who are watching. Apologies that I cannot present this in front of all of you, but to be fair, I have very bad stage fright, so I kind of prefer it this way. But anyways, joking aside, I would like to start off with a little bit of an imagining of what I kind of started with this thesis. Originally, I wanted to have a very long, drawn-out thesis about why King Alfred was great, per se, but talking with Dr. Bruce, I realized that was a little bit too big of a task, and it's been written about before. And so one critical idea I wanted to talk about was more integration. What did Alfred do that made him so great? And I think I have an answer to that. But first, I would like to throw us back to the first Viking attack at Lindisfarne in the year 793 AD. Lindisfarne was a monastery, of course, somewhere in Upper Scotland. There, it was largely unprotected, and they would be suddenly attacked by Vikings, who came to the monastery, pillaged, plundered, and according to Rudolf Hotner in his book, The Vikings, Rise and Fall of the North Sea Kings, there was no one spared. So imagine this happens, and then a myriad of and more strings of attacks like this start happening over Europe, who not only is just got done with integrating some of the pagan cultures in Central Europe, but also the Holy Roman Empire is having some struggles between the Pope and Charlemagne himself. Things are not looking so well in Europe, and suddenly some people coming up from the north are starting to raid you. Well, that is the impact of the Vikings. And for Alfred the Great of Wessex, it was almost a call to action for the Anglo-Saxons. First, I should give a little bit of background. He is called great for a reason. He is very influential in the British world. This is addressed by John B. Niles in his book, The Idea of Anglo-Saxon England. Niles kind of talks about how Alfred has this very clear political personality that British people like. He also represents a old time of when the British had almost this great and powerful national identity when they overcame some of their shortcomings. It's just the Anglo-Saxon idea to them. That's what John B. Niles calls his book. He also says that Alfred's identity is laden with the ideas of myths, such as the story of him coming to some woman who was baking him some cakes, and she doesn't see him as king, or a myriad of other tales. Although, to be fair, that tale is also included in Acer's Life of Alfred, but we'll get there. In my opinion, I think King Alfred holds a place in the hearts of the British because he is properly established on who the Anglo-Saxons were when they fought against the Danes. He utilized the tactics of the Danes against them, and Alfred used this to strengthen his kingdom, Wessex, into a military and political power. And from his stepping stones of what he did, he created the Kingdom of England. So they view him as almost a national founder. But not only that, because of his personality, he is portrayed as some pious, righteous king. It almost becomes romantic. It wasn't entirely like that, although that is some of his character. Let's talk a little bit about the historiography of King Alfred, because I am talking about a subject from the Middle Ages when a lot of sources were, well, not very much around. There wasn't a lot written. Trying to get discerning facts about Alfred is a little bit hard, especially for primary sources. However, we do have two, and that's probably one of the reasons Alfred is so well documented, because not only was he pretty well liked during his reign, they wrote a lot about him, more so than most of the other Anglo-Saxon kings. So, for example, the first source I would like to talk about is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It has multiple copies that were created around parts of England. One of them is one of them came from one of them was created in London, and there's a lot of other ones that were copies made by monks. We do not have the original copy anymore, unfortunately, but we do have well, not original copy, the original source, but we do have copies. The reason why I like discussing, no, not like, but the reason I'm discussing this is because despite how there's many theories of authorship, the author of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle itself remains anonymous. Yet it has the most detailed account of King Alfred's reign. For example, unlike the next source I'm going to be talking about, called the Life of Alfred, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle covers both the beginning of Alfred's reign to the end, and then those who came before him and those who came after him. So it's not just a history of Alfred himself, although he certainly has quite a bit attributed to him. It's also a history of the Anglo-Saxons in general. So you will find Christian biases within this book. It was written, after all, to be a cultural... what's the word there? A cultural example of what the Anglo-Saxon people were. And it also has some very clear ties to showing Alfred having some of his authority from the papacy in Rome. So the question is, because we don't know who the author is, how do we trust its authorship? Maybe it was written afterwards. We don't have the original source. Well, I make the argument that we can agree with its authorship because it is mentioned in the next contemporary source, Acer's Life of Alfred. The chronicler Acer makes the point of mentioning Alfred compiled a he ordered some of his scribes to compile a chronicle of the Anglo-Saxon peoples. So I will talk about the Acer's Life of Alfred. One thing going in the Acer's Life of Alfred is it's written to be more of a personal biography. Acer inputs his own experiences with Alfred while he was working within his court. He also portrays Alfred in both positive and negative lights, which is why I think it's a very good primary source, because Acer seems critical about portraying his king, and honest. There are, again, Christian biases. Acer was from Wales, and he had some political motives behind it as well, such as the fact that he never mentions the wife of King Alfred. He mentions he married her, but he never mentions her by name. I have a feeling this is because her marriage was scandalous with King Arthur. Sorry, not Arthur, Alfred. I'm not talking about Arthur. Her marriage was scandalous with him, so he either forgets or simply avoids mentioning her name. However, it is also filled with condemnation, such as the moments when King Alfred refused to listen to some of his subjects in his youth, as well as condemning him for some of his more violent ways of dealing with the Vikings. However, not everyone agrees this is an original source. Alfred Smith of the University of Kent, he challenged the authorship, claiming it was written by a Christian monk named Brithurft, I think that's how you pronounce it, a century after Alfred's death. He mentions this because he believes the Latin is very dubious and a little bit different than how the dialect would have been spoken during Alfred's reign. However, historians such as Simon Case of Cambridge University, who is an expert of Anglo-Saxon studies, completely dismissed this claim. He pretty much found the claims dubious. And also, that Dorothy Whitelock of Reading University in 1967, decades before this, already kind of disputed some of his main ideas. Her criticism and defense of the work noted that if it was a forgery, it would have been impossible to do without 9th century sources, as well as the fact that she found the criticism of the Latin dubious. If we remember, in Acer's Life of Alfred, he mentions that Alfred wanted to make an Anglo-Saxon language. So what we have here is possibly Latin going out of the Latin being a little bit more, so to say, not as refined, maybe. But apparently Dorothy Whitelock disputes some of these ideas. And then she states, even if it was a forgery, the author would have had been a talented researcher. One of the things I like to mention for myself with her argument is that considering the text has outlines of Viking tactics and military movements that took place in a little bit more detail than the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, I think she's right. You would have had to do an impossible amount of research, or at least had eyewitness accounts, if you weren't even there. It doesn't make much sense to have these sources and things when it just would have been outdated. With this in mind, I feel comfortable in saying Acer's work is a contemporary primary source, which then gives precedence to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So, with those two primary sources is what I based my thesis on for Alfred, as well as other secondary sources. So, with that in mind, keeping in mind that yes, these two sources have Christian biases, and keeping in mind that yes, they are primary sources, I think we have at least some idea of what we're getting into. Maybe not the entire full story, but again, because we are in the Dark Ages, we don't have a lot else to work off of. So let's be critical. Let's examine the character of Alfred. Alfred grew up with the royal family of Wessex was in a crisis. His older brother Aethelbald conspired against his father Aethelwulf when Aethelwulf was traveling to the mainland Europe. Because of this, Aethelbald proceeded to challenge and take over the throne while his father was gone. And when Aethelwulf returned, well, he got into a dispute with his son, and they ended up splitting the kingdom in half, where Aethelwulf would control Essex and Ethelbald would be in control of Wessex until he would end up dying. Acer manages to portray Aethelbald as an immoral king, mostly because he married his own stepmother named Judith. Acer kind of talks about this as like an abomination, really sickening, especially when we're considering a very Catholic culture. So with his hostile takeover, Wessex kind of got weakened, and then you have all these Viking attacks going around toward Mercia and Northumbria, and suddenly Wessex is in a bad spot. And then we have young Alfred here, kind of growing up when his family is in a little bit of a mess. Acer describes Alfred as such. He had an aspiration to learn. He was not literate until the age of 12 because apparently his family didn't take the time to really show him. They read to him, but they did not teach him how to read. And because of this, Alfred had a desire not only to get more literate, but he wanted to teach literacy to the rest of England. He details this in his Anglo-Saxon translation of Gregory's Pastoral Cares, that he wanted to boost literacy and actually unify and make the Anglo-Saxon language into something uniform, something written, because beforehand it had only been spoken. And this is pretty much one of the foundations for Old English being written into a language. Acer also portrays Alfred as a pious king. Alfred was someone who would pray to God to avoid his vices and relieve him of bad health, which brings to the next point. Alfred was someone who struggled with health issues. Because of this, he often had pain, and to be a little bit unprofessional, considering he had all this pain most of his life, him going out and fighting with his men, that's pretty badass. Which I think is kind of Acer's point. But back to being professional, there's also vices of Alfred. Alfred in his youth, he ignored some of the demands of his people, which made him very unrecognizable when he was trying to rally up some of the Anglo-Saxons to go against the Vikings. So he was unrecognized by his people because he just basically ignored their plight. He also managed to burn London and killed a lot of hostages there when he was taking over that city. And also, as I believe Acer implies, his marriage with his wife Aethelswith, I think that's how it's pronounced, Ealhswith, was probably a little bit scandalous. So Alfred was not without his faults. However, I think he also had a lot of good. Dr. Eleanor Duckett of Smith College describes Alfred as so. Alfred saw the ideal ruler, who was the father of his people for their instruction, who was the mother in compassion. He must ever be working for his subjects, utterly loyal to them and their welfare, evenly poised, holding both their fear and their love. So Alfred had the mindset of wanting to be beneficial to his people. He was not a selfish king like his brother, and considering that, you can understand his actions going forward. Now, let's examine the character of the Danes. The Vikings, in this case, were the chronicles of the Anglo-Saxons show Alfred's main enemy being the Danish king Guthrum. There was very little known about him in the contemporary sources, however. Because I couldn't find much on him, I decided instead I should examine the Vikings in general. What were they after? Well, why did they want to invade Britain? Well, I could argue that they were complex and a political people. Vikings were not brutes. Well, some of them were, but not all Vikings were brute. Not all of them were killing in the name of Odin and Thor and all these other stereotypes you see in TV. Rather, though they had things like berserkers, though they did have tendencies to rape and pillage, they had political reasons for it. Gareth Williams of the British Museum expresses that Vikings were not these savage glorifiers of war. Rather, a lot of them were funded by jarls and were there to establish their own trade. Ian Heath gives his own theory, suggesting that the growing powerful medieval kingdoms and their trade also attracted piracy and the willingness to colonize. So you have the Vikings having motives to rape and pillage and plunder, but why? What was the old underlying reason? Well, Heath also explains that there was a growing population of the Danish people during the medieval age. In fact, there was a boost in Norway and the Danelands. Contemporary Norman chronicler Dane Dudo of St. Quentin expressed this was because Vikings practiced polygamy. He said because of the amount of polygamy going on, there was a lot of children born, there was a boost in men, and a lot less women to have wives with. So, you're suddenly out of women, the population's growing, and if we're going to follow Rudolf Fortner's of the Dresden Institute's idea that the Viking economy had to change because it had to go from hunter-gatherer to an agricultural economy simply because there's such a population boost. What does this mean? It means there's a lot of young men looking for new land, looking for new wives, and possibly slaves. Andrew Lahr of National Geographic seems to actually express this point. He notes that there were kidnappings in Dublin which the Vikings had committed, and they would take women into polygamous lifestyles. So, mingled with the fact that they couldn't support their population, some of them were probably looking for trade routes, and some of them honestly probably just wanted plunder. You have some reasons here. And I think some of those reasons extend to the Vikings who did attack Wessex and the rest of England. Because the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Acer's Life of Alfred doesn't really explain what happened. Acer gives the idea that, this is retribution for the sins of Ethelbald or the sins of the Anglo-Saxons, but being a little bit more critical of that, I think it was more circumstances than it was God's retribution. Because after all, Alfred would take the time to convert these men. So my main argument here is that Alfred used his conflict with the Danes and adapting their tactics to strengthen his state of Wessex. We should talk about how he failed at this at first. Alfred's failure began at the Battle of Reading in 871 when his father, King Ethelwulf, was slain. A little bit before that, he actually had a minor victory. However, the Vikings returned to their capital city of Reading and started to manage to slay Ethelwulf. Because of this, Alfred's brother had to be put on the throne. Rather, rather fast, the new King Ethelred. And Alfred did win the Battle of Ashdun with his brother. That would be a very short-term victory, though, because Ethelred, in the same year of 873, I believe, Ethelred would die for causes they don't really explain. And so, Alfred is left on the throne. He, at first, asked his brothers if they wanted to go, but his older brothers said no. So you have very, very young King Alfred on the throne, and he's in the middle of a large crisis. And continuing as king, Alfred would be tricked by the Vikings some more. At the Battle of Wilton, they made a false retreat, and they managed to slay a lot of Alfred's army. The pagans, victorious, forced Alfred to sign for peace and pay them tribute. A very humiliating loss, to say the least. This was the part of Alfred's first error. He decided to fight the Vikings with few men. He didn't treat it as an actual crisis that needed to be addressed. He was busy elsewhere. He didn't listen to his people. And so, Alfred realized his mistake. He didn't have a large professional army. He had no way of fighting this constant barrage, especially when neighboring kingdoms like Kent and Northumbria and Mercia, they couldn't hold them back either. It was a mess. How did he expect to? And so Alfred had to come up with a new plan. He started paying off the Vikings like they asked, and he played the waiting game. He waited, slowly trying to build a large army, a large professional army, to actually confront the Danish men. However, it would have proved too late, as Alfred would be attacked in the midwinter of 878 by the Danes, who occupied Wessex and took the nobility under their authority. Alfred and his men fled from Reading, and Alfred would have to hide within the swamps of, I believe, Somerset. This, however, is the turning point of Alfred's career. Disgraced, left with very few men, we have a king who, even after all this, is still loyal to his people. After these lessons of humility, Alfred gathered in Somerset and made a base in Altheny. Here, he did a little bit more strategic moving around with some of his troops. He knew that the Vikings, like his own kingdom, they needed supplies, and so he would often raid the Viking supplies of his men, taking it back and feeding them and a lot of these other things. Just imagine he probably got food, weapons, maybe cattle and other things that live out there by himself. And then Alfred went to his people who didn't recognize him at first. He went to his remaining people and rallied armies at Selwood, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. With his armies all loyal to King Alfred, recognizing him as the king of the Anglo-Saxons, well, the king of the West Anglo-Saxons, they joined him together, and he marched until he finally encountered the King Guthrum's army, at the region of Illy's Oak, and he managed to chase him all the way towards Eddington. Guthrum's army, fortified in a I don't know how big it was, to be honest. The Chronicle doesn't exactly say. It simply says there was a Viking fort at Eddington, and Alfred took about 2 weeks to get through it. He pursued the fortress, and with the battle that took 2 weeks, Alfred starved out the pagan hosts in their fortress, waiting them out as they ate all their food. The temperature started dropping, the Vikings were shivering, and while the Anglo-Saxons were pretty much just fine, foraging by themselves, until finally some of them were slain, and the Anglo-Saxons broke through their fortress, I would imagine, and they took their goods, as it is explained in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. King Guthrum surrendered. He had been utterly defeated, and he went to Alfred and said, "You can take some of my men in exchange for your hostages." Guthrum was desperate, but this is where Alfred strays differently from his people, from his contemporaries. Alfred was merciful. He was showing his idea of how statescraft should be done. Instead of punishing the Vikings, and honestly probably that would have instilled more of their wrath, he simply told them to get out of his kingdom. Alfred also offered to baptize Guthrum, with Guthrum becoming his godson and Alfred becoming a godfather. Yes, the godfather. He would form the Danelaw, and he gifted Guthrum with treasure and a feast, as per baptism rituals back then. With Guthrum, Alfred would form the Danelaw, and the Danes would end up occupying Northumbria. I believe this was both Alfred showing his piety, being an example of the Christian way of governing. The Christian way of governing was not brutish. It wasn't completely destroy your enemy. No, Alfred wanted to show, hey, we're merciful. We also kind of need each other. So, surrender, go back to your homeland you've utterly lost. This is the Christian way of defeat. However, I also think this was a little bit of political positioning. Considering Guthrum is his godson, that gives Alfred religious authority over him, as well as political authority. It's also a little bit humiliating to these Vikings who were pagan. Regardless, Edington was a turning point. After Edington, Wessex began to grow much, much stronger. The kingdoms of Northumbria and East Anglia submitted to Wessex and became vassals, and they started to grant Alfred an actual professional army with actual levies. So Alfred could replicate other kingdoms like what was going on in Germany or the Franks. So, while Alfred did have a few minor defeats, such as in 1882 when he was defeated in East Anglia, Alfred kept getting stronger and stronger the more he took on the Danes. For example, when he decided to take Kent, he actually managed to split his army to give it greater mobility, another Viking tactic he learned. He also managed to take London, which was a very critical battle to maintain Anglo-Saxon control of England. As it's said in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, then they advanced and put that host into flight, stormed the fort, and seized everything inside of it, both property and women and also children, and conveyed them all into London. Also with this, Alfred managed to strengthen his holding by creating burghs, fortifications dotted across the kingdom of Wessex, and he allowed it to help control his vassals with greater troop mobility. With this, Alfred also captured Viking ships. Viking ships. A lot of the longships were almost both merchant and also military vessels called Nors. I think that's how it's pronounced. Alfred made them longer, faster, and sturdier, so he could put more men. There's a lot more room on them. It wasn't a small. A lot of those Viking ships were about 40 to 70 feet in length. Alfred pretty much doubled that to about 120 feet or more, making these just massive military fleets. He pretty much created the English Navy. Because of this, though they did lose a few battles against the Vikings, after creating these powerful Nors, you see the last battle Alfred ever partakes in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is a Viking attack on the city of Devon. But Alfred and his troops managed to take their ships and just completely crushed the Vikings and drove them toward a storm until they were finally they crash landed upon some of the mainland of England and pretty much defeated. The Danes fled. They went back to either the Danelaw or back into mainland Europe. Alfred had created a swifter army, a fortified nation, and a formidable navy to defend his holdings. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle ends with Alfred on this note: "He was king over all of England, except that part that was under Danish domination, and he ruled the kingdom 28.5 years. I think that's telling. Near the beginning, Wessex was divided. It was conquered. It was weak. Alfred pretty much had to rebuild this thing from the ground up. And in the end, he controlled all of England. Well, except, of course, for the Danelaw. Which makes me conclude with this. Using Viking tactics, Alfred adapted the failing kingdom of Wessex and turned it into a powerful state. Let's get a little bit into retrospective. I don't believe Alfred had a grand idea for England. that wouldn't make any sense. He couldn't have foreseen the powerful British or the powerful English country that it would eventually become. And if you look at Alfred's actual tactics, it is more out of defense than it is anything offensive or conquering. And again, he let the Danes go back home. I doubt he would be actually conquering anything. If he was actually trying to conquer anyone, he would have probably tried to destroy the Danes as well. That wouldn't have been a good idea, in my opinion, but he probably would have. We see him taking a defensive stance. And yes, after Alfred's death, the Vikings would return. He didn't completely defeat them. His son, Edward the Elder, would have to fight them back, as well as his grandson, Aethelred. Yet Aethelred did turn Wessex into the Kingdom of England. But it would not be over for the Danish people and the Vikings in general. Eventually, you have the Danish king Canute the Great took over the English, conquering them, and created the North Sea Empire. And then, in the 11th century, you have Norman the Conqueror coming into England and basically establishing Norman rule. And the Normans were, of course, Norsemen as well as French. So, I would say the English could not escape the influence of the Vikings. But is that a bad thing? I would argue that's King Alfred's legacy. See, I don't think the footprint of the Danish would ever leave. And that's what Alfred proved. Instead of completely denying the Vikings, he instead embraced some of their ideas. He took some of their tactics and strategies, and he formed the state of Wessex as an actual people, someone recognizable, not just the Anglo-Saxons, the Anglo-Saxons. That's what truly made Alfred great. He made the best of a bad situation, and he came out on top. Thank you.